Welcome to Life Stories. In today's gripping tale, we delve into the heart of a system riddled with corruption, power struggles, and the relentless fight for justice. Join us as we follow Carter, a man caught in the web of deceit, as he takes on a corrupt police officer and the powerful forces behind him. As secrets are uncovered, Carter finds himself not just fighting for his own future, but for the truth that could dismantle a broken system. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's journey, an unforgettable story of courage, danger, and the pursuit of justice. It was one of those rainy nights where the city felt eerily still. The streets of Atlanta gleamed with the soft reflections of streetlights, their patches of orange light dancing on the wet asphalt. For me, Michael Carter, it was the end of a long, exhausting day. I had been working late, and all I wanted was to get home, settle into the quiet of my apartment, and leave the worries of the world behind. The sounds of the city were muffled by the heavy drizzle, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the comfort of getting home. But then, as I cruised down the quiet street, my peace was shattered by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. The stark, aggressive brightness of the sirens was enough to pierce through my fleeting sense of calm. I sighed, the exhaustion from the day weighing heavily on me. It wasn't the first time I'd been pulled over by a cop. It wasn't the first time I'd had to endure the tense, suffocating atmosphere that always seemed to accompany these encounters. As the patrol car pulled in behind me, I did what I had learned to do over the years: slow down and pull over to the side of the road. I turned off the engine and instinctively placed both hands on the steering wheel. I had done this countless times before, a habit ingrained in me from years of experience. My grip on the wheel tightened slightly as I glanced at the side mirror, watching as Officer Jake Thompson approached. Thompson was a tall, imposing figure, his stride oozing arrogance. He wore that smirk of superiority that I had seen far too many times. I knew him well enough. This wasn't the first time I had encountered Officer Thompson. He had built a reputation in the department for being overbearing, for pushing the limits of his authority in ways that most officers only dreamed of. In some ways, it felt personal. His behavior, his demeanor, it was always loaded with disdain. As he approached, I felt my blood begin to boil. The sense of injustice I had grown so used to over the years resurfaced. But I forced myself to remain calm. I had learned early on that staying composed, avoiding provocation, and following procedures were the only ways to avoid making things worse. I had been in situations like this before, where everything could escalate in the blink of an eye. This wasn't just any traffic stop, I could feel it in the air. Tonight, something was different. Officer Thompson leaned down and tapped on the door frame, his face close enough that I could see the smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't give me a chance to speak before barking. "License and registration." I nodded, keeping my voice steady as I replied. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" He let out a short, almost derisive laugh before answering. "You're driving too slow. What are you trying to hide?" I knew what was coming. The tone of his voice, the way he spoke to me, it wasn't just about traffic laws. It was a power play. He had already decided that I was a threat, that I was hiding something. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't going to be a routine stop. It wasn't about my driving or the weather, it was about me. It was about who I was and how he saw me. I took a deep breath and responded. "It's raining, officer. I'm just driving carefully." I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the way he looked me up and down, sizing me up as if I were somehow inferior. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to scan my face, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness. And then, without warning, he snapped, "Step out of the car. I want to search your vehicle." The demand was abrupt, and my heart skipped a beat. I felt the surge of anger rise within me, but I knew better than to let it control me. I couldn't resist now. Any wrong move, any hint of defiance, and the situation could spiral out of control. I had learned to pick my battles, to choose when to push back and when to hold my ground. "Yes, officer," I said quietly, unbuckling my seatbelt and opening the car door. I stepped out, the cold drizzle immediately soaking through my jacket. The rain felt heavier now, colder, like a reminder that I was standing alone, out in the open. As I stood there, facing Thompson in the dim light of the street, the air between us felt thick with tension. He stood a little too close, his presence oppressive, his eyes sharp as if trying to find a reason to escalate things further. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the judgment in his every movement. Thompson leaned in, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the rain. His voice dropped lower, his tone now laced with mockery. "License and registration," he repeated, as if this was some kind of game. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, officer." I opened the glove compartment and handed over the documents. Thompson grabbed the papers without looking at them, letting them drop carelessly onto the seat, as if they meant nothing. Then, his face twisted into that smug grin again. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he taunted, leaning in closer. "You seem very cautious. Or are you just cautious because you've got something to hide?" I bit back the growing irritation in my chest. I had been through this so many times before. The insinuation, the accusation, this wasn't just about checking paperwork. It was a provocation, a way to undermine me. But I wasn't going to take the bait. "I have nothing to hide, officer," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm just driving carefully because it's raining." Thompson didn't seem satisfied with my answer. He straightened up, eyeing me with suspicion. Then, without warning, he stepped back and ordered, "Step out of the car." My brow furrowed. "Officer, what have I done wrong?" He tapped the roof of the car, his impatience growing. "You think I need a reason to check your car? Step out now or I'll make things a lot worse for you." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could feel my pulse quicken, my muscles tense. But still, I knew better than to give in to the fear that was rising in me. I was being targeted, but I had to stand firm. As I stepped out of the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Something told me that tonight wasn't going to end simply. I stood in the rain, feeling the cold seep into my bones. But I kept my posture straight, my eyes focused. Officer Thompson was still standing too close. His presence felt more like a looming shadow than that of someone fulfilling his duties. The air felt thick, and I could taste the tension between us, as if every word we exchanged was building toward an inevitable confrontation. I knew that if I didn't handle this carefully, it could quickly spiral out of control. Thompson stood silently for a moment, his eyes scanning me, taking in every movement, every slight change in my demeanor. I kept my hands visible, my arms by my sides, just as I had been trained to do in situations like this. Every step I took, every word I said was carefully measured. Nothing could be left to chance. In my mind, I kept reminding myself to stay calm, to avoid doing anything that might make him feel threatened. Then, with an almost casual air, Thompson leaned in closer, his voice low but clear. "I'm going to search your car. You don't have a choice." There was no room for negotiation in his voice. He was not asking, he was commanding, with an authority that didn't feel earned, but rather imposed. His words hung in the air, making it clear that this was no longer just a traffic stop, it was personal. I could feel my pulse quicken. Something inside me stirred. But I held back, keeping my face expressionless. I had heard stories, seen videos of these types of encounters escalating into something much worse. But I knew I had rights. I had done nothing wrong. Still, as the officer's hand moved toward the door of my car, I felt a gnawing unease, a sense that I was on the brink of something I couldn't control. "Do you have a warrant for this search?" I asked, my voice steady, trying to assert some measure of control over the situation. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself or him, but it felt important to remind him of the law. Thompson raised an eyebrow, and a grin spread across his face. A warrant? You think you're a lawyer now? I'm the law here, and you're going to do what I say. His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. The smile that tugged at the corner of his lips only made the situation more sinister. It was as if he was enjoying the power he had over me. I didn't let his words provoke me. Instead, I focused on keeping my voice calm, controlled. I understand your duties, officer, but without a warrant. You don't have the right to search my car. I wasn't sure if this would make a difference, but I had to try. But Thompson was already moving toward my car, not even bothering to respond. He yanked open the door, and the sound of the metal scraping against metal made my stomach drop. The decision had already been made. He wasn't going to listen to anything I said. My mind raced, but my body remained still. I watched as Thompson peered into the front seat, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the interior of my car. His gaze lingered on the passenger seat for a moment before he glanced back at me, his eyes narrowing. Step aside, he ordered. I'm going to open the trunk. A chill ran down my spine. I felt a sudden shift, as though the situation had just moved into dangerous territory. I knew it was more than just a routine search now. There was something in the way Thompson moved. The way he looked at me, it was as if he was looking for something. Something he could use. I couldn't let him find whatever it was he was searching for. I knew my rights. But I also knew that defying him would only escalate things. So, I stood back, my fists clenched at my sides, watching him as he made his way to the back of my car. Thompson crouched down by the trunk, his flashlight illuminating the space inside. I could see him muttering to himself, as though I were the one causing him trouble. He pulled at the trunk handle, and the sound of it popping open sent a wave of dread through me. I had nothing to hide, yet I felt exposed, vulnerable. Thompson's actions felt deliberate, invasive. He wasn't just looking for contraband or evidence, he was looking for a way to undermine me, to find something that would give him the upper hand. As he began rummaging through the trunk, I stood motionless, watching him, trying to stay composed. My mind raced with possible scenarios. What would happen if he found something? What if he planted something? What if this moment, the one that seemed so trivial at first, became the turning point in a much larger game? Thompson's eyes gleamed as he ran his hands over the contents of my trunk, his gaze sweeping across the items with a kind of meticulousness that bordered on obsession. Then, his eyes fell on the black suitcase tucked away in the corner. The look in his eyes changed, and I knew immediately that he had found something of interest. The suitcase had been a gift, something I had been carrying with me, something that was meant to stay private. But now, it was the object of Thompson's attention. My heart rate quickened. I could feel the pressure building, a sense of impending doom hanging over me. Thompson's hands moved quickly, opening the suitcase with a soft click. I knew, in that moment, that this was no longer just about a traffic stop. It had turned into something much more dangerous. He was looking for something, and I had no idea what he hoped to find. As he flipped through the contents, the unease in my chest grew. What would happen if he found the documents inside? Would it be the end of everything I had worked for? Would my life, my reputation, be destroyed in an instant? Thompson's expression changed as he paused, his fingers hovering over the neatly organized papers. His face went pale as he scanned the pages, his confidence faltering. And in that moment, I realized that what was inside that suitcase was something far more powerful than I had ever imagined. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Who held the power now? The silence between us stretched thin, as though the very air had thickened with tension. Thompson's hand trembled as he held the documents from the suitcase. I could see his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking from one paper to the next. Something was wrong. I could sense it, the shift in his demeanor was unmistakable. What had he seen? What was it that made him so pale? So unnerved? I stood still. My mind racing. Part of me wanted to rush over and take the suitcase back. To close it before he could see too much. But I knew that moving too quickly, too aggressively, would only raise suspicion. I couldn't afford to make a misstep. I had to remain calm, controlled. The truth, whatever it was, had already been laid bare before him. Thompson seemed to snap out of his daze. But only just. He quickly closed the suitcase with a loud snap. As though the action itself could hide whatever he had seen. But the look on his face told a different story. It was a mixture of fear and disbelief. For the first time since this interaction had started, I saw the mask slip. The officer who had been so full of arrogance and confidence was now visibly shaken. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The truth, whatever it was, had already started its journey. "You're not going anywhere," Thompson said suddenly, his voice low, strained. The authority in his voice had faltered. And now it sounded more like a command given in desperation. His eyes were still fixed on the suitcase. His fingers twitching as though he wanted to open it again. To confirm what he had seen. I wondered what had shocked him so much. What could be in those documents that had the potential to ruin him? To ruin all of us? I stayed silent, watching his every move. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. It felt as though the very ground beneath us might give way at any moment. I couldn't help but wonder how far Thompson was willing to go to keep whatever secret he had just uncovered buried. Was he going to arrest me? Would he try to destroy the evidence? I could already feel the weight of the decision pressing on me. The fear of the unknown. His hand shook as he reached for his radio. But before he could make the call, the unmistakable sound of another car approached from behind. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the glint of headlights through the misty rain. I felt a brief surge of hope. Could help be on the way? Or was it just another threat? Thompson's eyes darted toward the headlights, his expression darkening. He clearly didn't want any interference. Especially not now. He gripped the radio tighter. But his movements became erratic. His breathing heavier. Before he could make a move, the other car pulled to a stop, its tires crunching on the wet pavement. A door opened, and a tall figure emerged from the vehicle. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light, but there was something about his presence that immediately made me wary. Thompson's gaze shot over to the newcomer, his hand tightening on his radio, his posture rigid. "You shouldn't be here," Thompson growled, but his voice lacked the earlier confidence. He was on edge now, and it was clear to me that this was no ordinary visitor. The man who stepped out of the car didn't seem bothered by Thompson's words. He walked toward us with a calm, deliberate pace, his footsteps echoing through the empty street. There was something about the way he carried himself, no signs of hesitation, no fear. He wasn't intimidated by Thompson's presence. "You're making a mistake, officer," the man said, his voice cool, composed. Thompson looked at him, his face twisted in anger. "Stay out of this," he spat. "This doesn't concern you." But the man wasn't fazed. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, just a flash of metal. But it caught the light in a way that made my stomach drop. A badge. Thompson's eyes widened. For a brief moment, I saw fear flicker across his face. He took a step back, as if the badge itself had the power to push him away. "You! What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice cracking with an edge of panic. The man with the badge didn't answer immediately. He simply stepped forward, his gaze steady. It was clear that he wasn't here to talk to Thompson. He was here to handle the situation. I stood silently, watching the exchange, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? Who was this person? And why did he have the power to instill such fear in Thompson? Then the man turned his gaze toward me, and I felt an unfamiliar sense of recognition. It wasn't the look of a stranger. but the look of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "You've got a lot of weight on your shoulders," he said softly. "But don't worry. We're taking it from here." The words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to exhale. Something was shifting. Something was finally going right. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle had only just begun. As Thompson stood frozen, unsure of how to react, the man with the badge stepped closer to me, his presence imposing but reassuring at the same time. He nodded slightly, as if signaling me to follow him. I didn't hesitate. I followed the man with the badge, not knowing exactly what awaited me, but trusting in his calm, assured presence. My feet felt heavier with every step, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a storm cloud. But I couldn't afford to hesitate now. The unknown had already crept too close. And for once, I felt as though I wasn't alone in this fight. We walked toward the car he had arrived in, the dim glow of the streetlights barely illuminating the wet pavement beneath us. The rain had tapered off to a light drizzle, but the air still felt thick with tension. I glanced back toward Thompson, whose expression had changed from anger to frustration, his eyes glued to the suitcase. For a moment, I considered warning him, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that the man with the badge was exactly the kind of ally I needed. Thompson was no longer a threat, he was a man trapped by the very system he had helped uphold. The car was old, weathered, with the unmistakable air of secrecy about it. The man unlocked the door and motioned for me to get in. His eyes flickered with a quiet intensity, but he said nothing. I did as I was told, sliding into the back seat and waiting for him to join me. The moment the door closed, the world outside seemed to fall away. Inside the car, there was no more rain, no more tension, just the hum of the engine and the weight of what was unfolding. The man started the car, and as we drove through the city streets, the low, steady hum of the tires on the wet road was the only sound. I stole a glance at the man driving, still unsure who he was, what his role in this was, or why he had come at just the right moment. He seemed to sense my curiosity because, after a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "My name is Detective Michael Harris," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I've been tracking Officer Thompson for a while now. He's part of a much bigger web of corruption, one that runs deep in the department." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I had known there was something more to Thompson, something deeper, but I hadn't fully grasped the extent of it. To hear Harris confirm my suspicions was both a relief and a shock. My stomach churned with the realization that this fight was far from over. "You're not the only one who's been affected by this system," Harris continued, his eyes on the road. "You don't know how many lives Thompson and others like him have ruined. I've been working with a small group of people inside the department. People who want to see real change. But it's dangerous. If you get too close to the truth, the system will do everything it can to bury you." I leaned back against the seat, absorbing his words. It wasn't just Thompson. This wasn't some isolated incident of police overreach. This was about a system that protected corruption, that shielded those in power from ever facing the consequences of their actions. For the first time in what felt like forever, I understood the true magnitude of the battle ahead. "Why help me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why now?" Harris turned to me, his eyes narrowing as if weighing my question. "Because you're the one who's holding the truth. Those documents, the ones in that suitcase, are a key to everything. They can take down not just Thompson, but a network of powerful people who think they're untouchable. If we can expose them, it'll be the start of something bigger. Something that can't be hidden anymore." His words hit me like a lightning bolt. The realization was clear. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about Thompson. This was about something larger, something systemic that needed to be exposed, no matter the cost. We reached a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, its windows dark and shuttered. It looked like a place no one would think to look twice at. Harris parked the car in front of the building. And before I could ask another question, he motioned for me to follow him. We made our way to the building's entrance. And as the door creaked open, I was hit with the smell of old paper and stale air. It was quiet. Too quiet. No sounds of people. No chatter. Just the eerie silence of a place long forgotten. Harris led me down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room at the back. Inside, there were several desks covered with stacks of papers, folders, and files. The room had the feel of a war room, everything meticulously organized, yet clearly meant to stay hidden from the outside world. "This is where we work," Harris said, his voice low as he closed the door behind us. "The documents you have, they're critical. But it's not just about exposing Thompson. It's about something much bigger than him. We need to make sure we protect these at all costs." I nodded, my mind still spinning from the revelation that I was now tangled in something much deeper than I had ever imagined. This was no longer just about a corrupt officer. It was about exposing an entire system that had been working in the shadows for far too long. As Harris sat down at one of the desks, pulling open a file and flipping through it, I realized something. I wasn't just a passive observer anymore. I was part of this now. My hands were tied to the truth. And there was no going back. "Get some rest," Harris said, his voice snapping me out of my thoughts. "Tomorrow, we make sure the world knows what's been happening. We'll send the message. But tonight, we prepare. Because once we go public, there's no turning back." I took a deep breath. The road ahead was going to be long. But I wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, I could see the faintest glimmer of hope. The truth was going to come out. It had to. The morning came too soon. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of the night before, of the suitcase, the documents, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen on my shoulders. The air in the small room felt thick with anticipation, and I could sense that Harris was already preparing for what was to come. His calm demeanor masked the urgency I could feel in every movement. By the time the sun rose, the office was already buzzing with activity. Harris had a small team, dedicated, quiet, and efficient. They didn't waste time on pleasantries, they got straight to work. Files were spread out, notes jotted down, and computers hummed as the team worked in silence. Each person clearly aware of the importance of the task ahead. Harris turned to me from his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration as he looked over a series of documents. "This isn't just about exposing Thompson," he said, his voice steady but intense. "We have to think bigger. The people behind him are well connected, and they won't let this go without a fight. But they'll slip up. They always do." His words were a cold reminder that the stakes were high. This wasn't a simple case of corruption, it was a tangled web of deceit that reached far beyond what I could have imagined. The more I learned, the more I realized how deep this went. Thompson was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and those who stood behind him had enough power to bury the truth forever if they were given the chance. I couldn't afford to be naive anymore. The danger wasn't just physical, it was systemic. The people we were up against had the resources to make anyone disappear, whether through silence or threat. But I wasn't about to back down. As the day wore on, the weight of the decision I had made began to settle into my bones. I wasn't just trying to expose one man's corruption, I was taking on a system that had been operating in the shadows for years. Harris, with his quiet confidence, was right. There was no turning back. The moment I had stepped into that car last night, the choice had been made for me. I found myself pacing in the dimly lit office, my thoughts scattered. The files were overwhelming, so much information, so many names, so many pieces of the puzzle. But there was no time to go through everything. Harris had been clear, the clock was ticking. "We need to move quickly," he said, breaking my train of thought. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. We can't let them. These documents, Everything in that suitcase. They're the proof we need. But we need to make sure it's out there for good. I nodded, feeling the cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. There was no easy way out of this. The system had been designed to protect the people at the top, and I was about to challenge that system head-on. But as I looked around the room at the faces of Harris's team, I knew I wasn't alone. We'll distribute the evidence carefully, Harris continued, his voice steady. We have contacts in the media, but we'll need to be cautious. If they get wind of this too soon, they'll do everything in their power to shut it down. We'll make sure it gets out there, no matter what. The plan was set. We would release the documents, but we would do so strategically. No one could afford to make a mistake. Harris's team was already reaching out to trusted contacts in the media, lining up multiple outlets to ensure that the truth couldn't be silenced. Each piece of evidence would be carefully distributed, with layers of protection to guard against any potential leaks. We'll need to act fast, Harris said, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the documents once more. Once the media gets a hold of this, they'll start to ask questions. And when they do, we'll be ready. This ends now. The finality in his voice left no room for doubt. This was the moment that would determine everything. We couldn't afford to hesitate. My hand reached into my jacket pocket and touched the USB drive. A small piece of technology that held the key to everything. I knew that, in the end, it was all about this moment, this decision. This was the tipping point. We can't do this alone, I said, my voice breaking the silence. We'll need to bring in more people. There are others out there who've been affected. People who can corroborate this. We need to make sure we have all the support we can get. Harris looked up at me, his expression softening. You're right. This isn't just about exposing the corruption. It's about building a movement. We'll need everyone who's willing to fight for the truth. And together, we'll make sure it can't be buried. The team rallied together, and we spent the rest of the day preparing. The documents were copied, encrypted, and prepared for distribution. Each person had a role to play, and every movement was calculated. It was all about ensuring that once the truth was out there would be no going back. As evening approached, the weight of the decision I had made began to sink in. There was no turning back now. We were about to face something far bigger than any of us could have imagined. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure: the truth was no longer something we could keep hidden. It was time to fight. The night was heavy with tension as we finalized our preparations. The office had emptied out, leaving just a few of us, including Harris, who had worked tirelessly throughout the day to ensure everything was in place. The time had come. The moment we had been waiting for and dreading was finally upon us. It was time to release the evidence. Harris sat at his desk, his fingers moving over his keyboard with a quiet intensity. I could see the weight of the decision on his face. The information we were about to send out would change everything. The world would know the truth, but not without consequences. This is it, Harris said, his voice low but resolute. Once it goes out, there's no pulling it back. We're giving the world a glimpse into the darkness that's been hiding in plain sight for years. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The files and the USB drive felt heavy in my hands. But it wasn't just the physical weight that concerned me. It was the sheer magnitude of the truth we were about to expose. We weren't just fighting one man's corruption, we were taking on an entire system that had been built on lies and deceit. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Are we sure this is the right time? Will they be ready to handle it? Harris didn't look up from his screen, but his voice remained calm. We've done everything we can to prepare. We've got contacts at multiple news outlets, and the backup systems are in place. This isn't just about getting it out, it's about making sure it doesn't get erased. We've covered our tracks. I knew what he meant. The backup systems were crucial. If we released the documents now, there was a chance they would be pulled before anyone could read them. The encrypted files, the multiple servers, The carefully timed release, all of it was designed to ensure that once the truth was out, it would stay out. The clock was ticking. The world was about to be set on fire. And I wasn't sure if we were ready for the fallout. Harris clicked a few more buttons, his face hardening as the final file was prepared. Once we hit send, everything changes. But this is the right thing to do. It's time to bring this to light. I walked over to the desk, the urgency of the moment heavy in my steps. I watched as Harris hovered over the keyboard, his fingers poised to send the email. "Are we ready?" "Yes," Harris replied, his voice unwavering. "It's done." He clicked the mouse. And just like that, the files were released. The email was sent. The documents uploaded. And the truth was now in the hands of the public. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, unsure of what to expect next. For a few moments, nothing happened. The world kept turning. The streets outside unchanged. But then, slowly, notifications began to trickle in. Emails. Messages. The phone buzzed incessantly. News outlets began to pick up the story. And the social media reactions started flooding in. Harris looked at me, his eyes focused. "We did it. The world is about to know." But as the adrenaline started to wear off, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in my stomach. The system we had exposed would not go down without a fight. I knew the people behind it wouldn't just let this slide. "They won't stop," I said quietly, almost to myself. "They'll do everything they can to shut it down." Harris turned to me, his face grim. "We know that. But this is the beginning. We've taken the first step. And there's no going back." The room seemed to pulse with a new energy as the news began to spread. I watched the digital storm unfold, as if the world was waking up to a reality they had been blind to for far too long. But even as I saw the reaction, I couldn't escape the nagging thought in my mind. What would come next? Would we be able to withstand the inevitable retaliation? I wasn't sure, but I knew we had no choice now. The truth had been set free. There was no turning back. And whatever came next, we would face it together. The storm had begun, and there was no telling how far it would spread. But one thing was certain, we weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The hours after the release felt like a blur. My mind was racing, and every notification that popped up on my phone seemed to amplify the weight of what we had just done. We had exposed corruption at a level few could comprehend. But with that came the inevitable chaos. We knew this would happen. It was always part of the plan. But now that it was real, the consequences felt much larger than we had anticipated. As the morning light began to creep into the room, I stared at the screen. The numbers were growing. The reactions pouring in from across the globe. News outlets were publishing articles. Social media was ablaze. And the public was beginning to wake up to the story we had so carefully pieced together. But alongside this surge of attention, there was something else: fear. A fear that things were about to spiral out of control. The first signs of retaliation didn't take long to appear. It started small, subtle at first. Posts on social media trying to discredit the truth we had shared. Comments calling us liars. Trying to paint us as reckless. Trying to undermine our efforts. It was expected. But soon, the comments grew louder, more organized. The system was fighting back. "Have you seen the latest?" Harris's voice broke through my thoughts. He was sitting across the room, his own screen filled with responses from various outlets. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the sharp realization that we had put ourselves at the center of a storm. "They're trying to bury it already," Harris said, his voice tight with frustration. "They're using every tool at their disposal to twist the narrative, to make it look like we're the ones in the wrong." I stood up, pacing the room as the full weight of what we had done began to sink in. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore, it was a battle for survival. We had exposed a corrupt network. But the people in power weren't going to take that lightly. They would do whatever it took to silence us. Are we prepared for what's coming next? I asked. My voice quiet but steady. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he clicked through a few more articles, his eyes narrowing as he read. I could see his fingers trembling slightly as the news began to hit harder. The system was moving quickly to shift the narrative. Stories were being retracted, reworded, and manipulated. But we had covered our tracks. The evidence was irrefutable. I think so, Harris said after a moment. We have the right backup in place. The servers are secure, and the contacts are already working to make sure the story doesn't die out. But this is just the beginning. I sat down beside him, my eyes scanning the flood of responses that were continuing to pour in. This wasn't a fight we could win with one move. It was going to take more than just releasing the truth. It would take strategy, persistence, and a willingness to stand firm in the face of whatever came our way. We've got to keep pushing, I said, my voice firm. We can't let them control the story. This is bigger than just one person or one piece of corruption. This is a system. And if we stop now, they'll bury it. We can't let that happen. Harris looked up, a fire returning to his eyes. I'm with you. But we need more help. We need to get this out to even more people, make sure the system can't shut it down. We weren't just journalists anymore. We were the voice of accountability in a world that had long turned a blind eye. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about making sure that truth would not be buried again. And now, as I sat there, watching the storm of reactions unfold, I understood one thing: we had ignited something much bigger than ourselves. And we were in this fight for the long haul. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked down at the number. It was Emily. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. The tone in her voice was urgent. We're not done yet, she said, her voice low but determined. It's just beginning. You were right. We've got to keep going. I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, I know. But they're already fighting back. They'll stop at nothing. Then we'll make sure we're one step ahead. Emily replied. Get ready. The real work is about to start. And so, the real fight began. The next few hours felt like a blur of action and tension. Emily's words echoed in my mind. The real work is about to start. I had no idea what to expect. But I knew one thing for certain: the system we had just exposed wasn't going to take it lying down. The backlash was already beginning. And we had to stay one step ahead. The storm was coming. And we needed to prepare. As I sat in the dimly lit room, the urgency of the situation began to feel like a heavy weight on my chest. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I sifted through the evidence. Every document, every piece of information we had gathered, had to be in the right place, secured beyond the reach of anyone who would try to erase it. Are we good? I asked Harris, who had been relentlessly checking and double-checking the encrypted files. His face was drawn, tired, but his focus remained sharp. Everything's backed up. Every document's on multiple servers. And the USB drive is securely locked. Harris replied. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. But we both know it's not enough. They'll try to get to us through other means. I felt the same cold sense of reality wash over me. They weren't just going to try to erase the evidence. They'd come after us directly. The people we were up against didn't just control the narrative, they had the power to ruin lives. The fact that we were still breathing meant that we hadn't crossed the final line just yet. We need to move fast, I said, breaking the silence. We have to make sure this gets out to as many people as possible right now. Not later. Not after the dust settles. Now. I picked up the phone and started calling the contacts we had secured. Emily was already on her way to the next phase, getting the story into more hands. Securing interviews. And pushing for public pressure. She was relentless in a way that inspired me. No matter the odds. She was determined to make sure the world saw the truth. As I spoke with one journalist after another, I could hear the storm brewing in the background. Public outrage was growing louder. People were finally starting to realize that they weren't just angry at one officer or one corrupt system. They were angry at the entire machinery that had allowed this to happen. After a series of calls, I sat back, exhausted. The weight of it all seemed to crush down on me. But there was no time to dwell. We had to keep moving. The next step was to ensure that the story couldn't be hidden. We had to make sure the evidence wasn't just in the hands of a few key players. This wasn't just about media coverage. It was about getting the truth into the hands of ordinary people, people who could help us fight back against the tidal wave of lies that was sure to follow. Harris and I set up a meeting with several other journalists and activists we trusted. We needed to start organizing protests, rallies, anything that could keep the pressure on. We couldn't let this die down. We couldn't let the powerful people behind this story regroup. I was halfway through drafting an email when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "We've got a problem," the message read. "They're trying to shut us down." I felt a pang of fear but quickly pushed it aside. Of course. They were. They'd been playing this game for years. Manipulating people. Controlling the system. But we had the upper hand now. We had the truth. It was time to fight back harder, faster, smarter. And we weren't going to stop. Not until every last person in that corrupt network was exposed. "We need to get moving," I told Harris. His face was grim as he nodded, knowing the gravity of what lay ahead. "We've got a lot of work to do." We were ready. The fight for justice had only just begun, and we were determined to see it through to the end. And so, Carter's fight for justice continues, as the truth he uncovered shakes the very foundations of a corrupt system. His unwavering courage has sparked a movement, one that is gaining strength every day. While the battle is far from over, Carter knows that the power of truth, and the support of those who stand with him, will carry him forward. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to follow our next video. More gripping tales of courage, justice, and the human spirit are coming your way.